Their aunt tossed them into the streets, convinced she had taken the mansion for herself. But what she didn't know was that the house she claimed as hers had never belonged to her in the first place. She thought she had destroyed their lives, but the truth was waiting hidden in papers she never saw coming. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and the shocking moment she learned the mansion had never been hers. And to understand how it happened, we need to go back to the days when the mansion still felt like home. Before everything fell apart, the mansion was their world. It was more than a house. It was a kingdom, and they were its children, safe, cherished, untouchable. Each morning, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, painting golden streaks across polished wooden floors that creaked softly under bare feet. The walls held the faint scent of lavender from the garden, drifting inside through open windows. Their father's laughter echoed from room to room, blending with the gentle hum of their mother's voice, and the warm aroma of bread rising in the oven filled every hallway. Life didn't just happen inside those walls, it thrived. Every corner of the house carried a memory. The sweeping staircase was where they once slid down the banister, giggling until their mother pretended to scold them, her lips twitching with a hidden smile. The library held the sound of their father's voice as he read to them at night, his finger tracing each line of text with care, his patience endless. The garden was where they chased fireflies in summer, barefoot in the grass, while the mansion glowed behind them like a lighthouse, promising safety no matter how dark the night became. To them, the mansion wasn't just stone and wood, it was their sanctuary. Their father always reminded them that the mansion wasn't just a home. To him, it was a legacy, something meant to endure long after his footsteps faded. He often walked them through the gardens, pausing by the oak trees his own father had planted decades earlier. "These roots," he would say, pressing his hand against the rough bark, "are like ours, strong, enduring. They'll hold no matter how fierce the storm." He told them the mansion was not about wealth, but about history, about love stitched into every beam, every brick. Their mother carried that truth in her heart too, pouring warmth into every room until even the grandest halls felt soft and alive. She made it feel less like a monument and more like a heartbeat. To outsiders, the mansion may have seemed intimidating, its iron gates tall, its stone walls commanding, its chandeliers glittering like jewels. But to the children, it was never cold. It was alive with laughter, with music, with the kind of love that made them believe nothing could touch them. Then the storm came. Death doesn't knock. It doesn't give warning. One day their parents were alive, filling the halls with life and light. The next, the children stood in black, staring at two caskets lowered into the ground. The earth swallowed their parents as the sky hung gray and heavy. They clutched each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white, as though holding on could somehow keep their world from shattering. But grief didn't arrive gently. It crashed into them, unrelenting, dragging them under like a tide. The mansion changed after that. It didn't feel safe anymore. Silence pressed against the walls like a weight. Shadows stretched longer. At night they swore they heard echoes of the past, the low murmur of their father's voice, the soft call of their mother, but when they opened their doors, there was nothing, just emptiness. The house that once felt like a shield now felt hollow, echoing with absence, like a body drained of breath. And in that silence, when they were most fragile, she appeared. Their aunt arrived at the funeral draped in black silk, her perfume sharp enough to sting. She pressed a lace handkerchief to her eyes, her tears looking as polished as her jewelry. She pulled the children close, her voice low and syrupy. "Don't worry. I'll take care of everything. You're not alone." And in that moment, they believed her. They needed to. With their parents gone, her words felt like a lifeline, a rope to cling to as the ground caved beneath them. It didn't take long for her presence to spread through the mansion. She moved through the halls with unnerving familiarity, slipping into their parents' rooms, touching their belongings, rearranging drawers as if the house had been hers all along. The children told themselves it was grief, that perhaps she was simply trying to stay close to her lost sibling. But they couldn't ignore the way her eyes lingered on the silver candlesticks, the antique clock, the paintings on the walls. She didn't look at them with sentiment. She looked at them with hunger. Deep down, the truth was already there, whispering. What gleamed in her eyes wasn't sorrow. It was calculation. She wasn't mourning. She was assessing, tallying, planning. But the children buried that thought because what else could they do? They were young, broken, desperate for someone to hold the pieces together. They convinced themselves that family meant protection, that her promises were genuine, that their parents would never have left them vulnerable. Maybe that's why the warning signs slipped by. Maybe that's why they ignored the sharper edge in her voice, the way she barked instructions as though she were the head of the house, the way her footsteps echoed with authority instead of compassion. She spoke of responsibility and sacrifice, but her gaze betrayed something darker and ambition that stretched far beyond caretaking. And so, while they grieved, while they clung to each other in the echoing halls, their aunt was already laying her plans. She wasn't here to protect them. She was here to strip them of everything: their comfort, their dignity, and the mansion itself. At first, they wanted so badly to believe her. She was their aunt, their blood, the woman who had stepped forward when no one else did. To the outside world, she looked like a savior dressed in black at the funeral, clutching their shoulders, whispering promises of protection. People praised her. How wonderful of her to take the children in, they said. What a blessing to have someone so responsible in the family. And for a short time, the children believed it too. They told themselves she was grieving, that her sternness was simply stress, that her presence was a shield against a world that suddenly felt dangerous and unpredictable. But little by little, the mask she wore began to slip. Her tone changed first. Gone was the soft, reassuring voice she had used when she first pulled them close. It was replaced with sharpness, with orders that cracked through the halls like whips. She no longer spoke to them, but at them, every word carrying the weight of command. Do this, don't touch that, stay out of here. The mansion, once a place of freedom, slowly morphed into a maze of restrictions. Rooms that had always been open, the study where their father wrote late at night, the music room where their mother played soft melodies, even the library where they had curled up together on rainy days were suddenly forbidden. Her rules spread like chains across the house. Each day another door was locked, another space closed off, until their world grew smaller and smaller. Then came the inventory. They would see her wandering from room to room, a notebook in hand, her lips pursed, her eyes cold. She wasn't admiring the home or reminiscing about her sister, their mother. No, she was tallying, calculating, assigning value to every object she laid eyes on. She studied the silver cutlery their mother had polished every Christmas, the paintings their father loved to pause before, the antique grandfather clock that had ticked steadily in the dining room for generations. To the children, these things were sacred, bound to memory and meaning. But to their aunt, they were nothing more than commodities. She saw price tags where they saw memories. She saw profit where they saw love. At first, things vanished quietly. A vase disappeared from the hallway. A bowl went missing from the dining room. They told themselves they were imagining it, that grief was playing tricks on their minds. But soon, the losses became impossible to ignore. Their mother's jewelry box gone. The pearl necklace she wore on special occasions missing. The ring their father never took off when alive sold, traded, erased. When the children asked where these things had gone, her reply was a dagger. Don't concern yourselves with things that don't belong to you. Her voice was cold, final. And in that moment, they understood something they hadn't wanted to face. She didn't see the mansion or its treasures as their inheritance. She saw them as hers. Her performance for the outside world only grew more convincing as she stripped the house from the inside out. Neighbors began calling her the lady of the house, and she basked in it. She dressed in their mother's pearls, served tea to guests in their family's china, and carried herself with the authority of someone who believed the lie she was selling. She played the role of protector so well that outsiders never questioned her. But every time she introduced herself that way, the children's hearts sank deeper. Because inside the walls they saw the truth the world didn't. Behind closed doors, she was cruel. When grief overwhelmed them, when the weight of loss made them cry, she snapped. Tears won't bring them back, she said with disdain. Stop wasting time feeling sorry for yourselves. When they tried to hold onto their parents' traditions, reading in the study, keeping the music room alive, she mocked them. Childish, pointless, grow up. Her cruelty wasn't just in her words, but in her intent. She wanted to break them down, to make them feel small, powerless, unworthy. She wanted them to forget that the mansion had ever been theirs. Meals around the long dining table turned silent, filled with tension thick enough to choke on. She sat at the head of the table like a ruler surveying her kingdom, sighing at every small thing that displeased her. Even the clink of silverware seemed to irritate her, as though their very presence in the house was an offense. At night, they heard her locking doors, turning keys in rooms that had always been open. One by one, spaces once alive with family became shut off, claimed by her. The children began to feel like guests in their own home, unwanted ones at that. Day by day, the mansion grew colder, not because of the air, but because of her presence. The warmth their parents had poured into the house was fading under her shadow. Where there had been love, there was now suspicion. Where there had been safety, there was now fear. The children felt smaller, weaker, as if the walls themselves were pushing them out. And still, the outside world didn't see it. To neighbors, she was the grieving sister who had stepped up. To family friends, she was the responsible guardian ensuring the estate was managed. To them, she was kind. But to the children, she had become something else entirely, a conqueror, a usurper, someone who was not just living in the mansion, but consuming it, stripping it of every piece of their parents that remained. But what they didn't realize was that all of this, the rules, the sales, the cruelty, wasn't the peak of her greed. It was only the beginning, because soon she wouldn't just make them feel like strangers in the mansion. She would make sure they had no place in it at all. The storm inside the mansion had been building for weeks. It was in the way their aunt's footsteps grew heavier, echoing through the halls like warning drums. It was in her sighs at the dinner table, exaggerated and full of irritation, as though their very presence spoiled her appetite. It was in her eyes, sharp and unblinking, always watching, always waiting for them to slip. The children felt it pressing against them every day. They had become careful with their movements, careful with their words, careful even with their breaths, as though any wrong step might bring the storm crashing down. And still, no amount of care could save them. It began with little detonations, a slammed door here, a snapped insult there. Once she flew into a rage because one of them left a book on the living room sofa. "Do you think this is a library?" she hissed. Another time, she scolded them for laughing too loudly at night, saying their joy was disrespectful. "You don't care that I'm grieving," she accused, even though it was their hearts that carried the deepest wounds. Each day she seemed to invent new reasons to be angry, as if she were rehearsing for a moment that had not yet come. That moment arrived one evening after dinner. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were bracing for impact. The children pushed food around their plates, neither daring to speak. She sat at the head of the table, tapping her fork against her plate in an impatient rhythm, her lips pressed into a thin line. And then, without warning, she shoved her chair back, the screech of wood against marble cutting through the silence. Her eyes burned with fury. "I've had enough of this," she snapped. Her voice was sharp, final, full of venom. "I will not live with ungrateful brats any longer." The children froze. The younger one's fork slipped from their hand and clattered against the plate. The older felt their stomach twist with dread. They had heard this tone before, but never like this. This wasn't frustration. This was finality. She stormed down the hallway, her heels striking the floor like thunder. The children scrambled after her, their voices trembling. "Wait! Please, what are you doing?" But she didn't answer. She flung open their bedroom doors, yanking open drawers with such force they nearly came off their tracks. Clothes were ripped out and tossed onto the bed. Shoes, books, toys, everything was grabbed in furious handfuls. She pulled out their suitcases and stuffed them with anything she could fit. Her movements wild, her breaths sharp. "Stop!" they cried. "Please stop! Those are ours!" But her face was stone. She didn't even look at them. She slammed the suitcases shut and dragged them down the stairs. The children ran after her, panic rising in their throats. "Why are you doing this? What did we do?" Her response was a dagger to the heart. She spun around on the staircase, her voice echoing through the halls. What did you do? You lived here, eating food you didn't earn, sleeping in rooms you don't deserve, acting as though this place belongs to you. But it doesn't. It's mine. Do you hear me? Mine. Her eyes were wild, gleaming with something far darker than anger. It was greed. It was triumph. She had been waiting for this moment. The children's knees nearly gave out beneath them. This couldn't be real. She couldn't possibly mean it. But then she turned, pulled the front door open, and with one violent motion hurled their suitcases out onto the stone porch. The bags tumbled open on impact, clothes spilling across the steps, shoes rolling into the dirt. The children stared in horror as everything they owned lay scattered and exposed under the night sky. Their hearts pounded, their breaths shallow. This wasn't an argument. This wasn't a threat. This was exile. Their aunt stood in the doorway, her figure framed by the glow of the chandelier behind her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. She was calm, almost satisfied. Her lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. And then she delivered the final blow. You don't live here anymore, she said coldly. Get out, and don't you dare come back. The door slammed shut with such force that the glass panes rattled. The sound echoed like a coffin lid being sealed. A moment later came the click of the lock, sharp and final. They stood frozen on the porch, the night air biting at their skin. Their belongings lay in disarray at their feet, a pitiful pile of memories and necessities. Across the street, lights flickered on, curtains shifted, neighbors were watching. The children could feel the weight of their stares, the whispers forming behind glass. Their aunt had poisoned their reputation long before this night, spreading stories about how spoiled and ungrateful they were. And now, as they stood in the cold with nothing, those lies became their reality in the eyes of the world. The younger one began to cry, soft at first, then louder, uncontrollable sobs that echoed against the mansion's stone walls. The older one wrapped their arms around them, holding on tightly, but their own eyes burned with tears they couldn't hold back. They sank down onto the curb, clutching each other, staring at the mansion that loomed behind them like a fortress they had been banished from. Through the glowing windows, they imagined her inside, settling into their parents' chairs, sipping tea with a satisfied smile. She thought she had won. She thought she had stripped them of everything, and in that moment, it felt like she had. The mansion was gone, their safety was gone, their family was gone. They were homeless, abandoned, betrayed by the very person who was supposed to protect them. The night swallowed their cries, the street around them eerily silent, except for the faint rustle of curtains and the distant hum of traffic. But what their aunt didn't know was that this moment, as devastating as it was not the end of their story. It was the beginning, because outside those locked doors, in the ashes of their despair, a truth was waiting, one so powerful it would shatter her illusion of victory and remind her that the mansion she clung to had never been hers at all. The first night outside the mansion was the kind of night that brands itself into memory forever. They sat on the curb in silence at first, unable to process what had just happened. Their belongings lay in pitiful piles around them, half-zipped suitcases, clothes spilling out onto the pavement, shoes scattered like discarded toys. The younger one cried quietly at first, little gasps muffled into the older sibling's shoulder, until the tears became sobs that shook their whole body. The older one held on tight, but their own throat ached with the weight of unspoken grief. Above them, the mansion glowed in the dark like a cruel reminder. The chandeliers burned warmly through the windows, casting golden light across the lawn as if mocking them. That light used to mean safety. It used to mean home. Now it meant betrayal, greed, and a locked door that would never open for them again. Their aunt had just thrown them out. She had ripped away every sense of belonging they had left. And as they sat there, watching the golden windows from the outside, it felt as though their parents had died all over again. Eventually, the cold forced them to move. The marble steps were freezing against their legs, and the night air bit at their skin with a sharpness that made their teeth chatter. They gathered what little they could carry and walked. Their shoes clicked against the pavement, the sound hollow in the empty streets. Every step away from the mansion felt heavier, like chains dragging behind them, as though the house itself was pulling at them, refusing to let go. They didn't know where they were going. They just knew they couldn't stay. They found shelter under a bus stop that night. The bench was hard, the roof barely kept out the drizzle, and the glow of the flickering street lamp only made the shadows seem darker. They huddled together, clutching their bags like shields. Every passing car made them shrink back. Every stranger's footsteps sent a bolt of fear through their veins. Sleep came in shallow bursts, their bodies tense even in slumber. That night, the world suddenly felt enormous and merciless, an endless stretch of cold streets and indifferent faces. The days that followed blurred together. Hunger became a constant ache in their stomachs, a gnawing emptiness that water couldn't wash away. They learned how to survive on scraps, splitting a single sandwich into 2 meals, drinking water until their stomachs sloshed just to quiet the pain. Their clothes grew dirty, their shoes wore down, and every mirror they passed reflected children who looked less and less like the ones who once lived in a mansion and more like shadows of themselves. They went from door to door, hoping anyone would take them in, even just for one night. Some doors opened out of pity, offering a couch or a spare blanket. But most didn't. Most closed with hurried excuses, voices that carried shame and fear. "We can't get involved," or "Your aunt said you're trouble." That was the cruelest part. Their aunt's lies spread faster than their cries for help. She had painted them as spoiled, entitled, ungrateful brats trying to steal what wasn't theirs, and people believed her. Neighbors they had known their whole lives looked at them differently now, with suspicion instead of kindness. Every rejection wasn't just a closed door, it was another nail in the coffin of their reputation. There were nights they managed to scrape together a few dollars sweeping floors at a diner, carrying groceries for strangers, or wiping tables until their hands smelled of soap and grease. Those nights, they bought a room at a rundown motel with buzzing neon lights and paper-thin walls. The sheets smelled faintly of smoke, the locks barely held, but at least it was a roof. At least for a few hours, they could close their eyes without flinching. Other nights, when money ran out, they ended up in shelters. There they lay shoulder to shoulder with strangers whose hollow eyes told stories of battles just as cruel as theirs. In those rooms, they learned to sleep lightly, clutching their bags as though their lives depended on it, and through it all, the mansion haunted them. Every night, when exhaustion finally pulled them into shallow sleep, they dreamed of its halls. They dreamed of their parents' laughter echoing across the walls, of warm meals at the dining table, of soft beds with clean sheets. But every morning, they woke to the bite of cold air, to empty pockets, to the memory of their aunt sitting smugly in their parents' chairs, believing she had won. The contrast was unbearable, yet even as despair wrapped itself around them like a heavy cloak, something stubborn refused to die inside them. It was small at first, like a flickering flame barely strong enough to resist the wind, but it grew with each passing day, fueled by the belief that this couldn't be the end of their story. They whispered to each other in the quiet moments, promising that someday the truth would surface. Someday the mansion would be theirs again. Someday justice would peel the mask from their aunt's face. And then, one afternoon, while digging through a box of old belongings they had managed to save from the mansion, that whisper of hope turned into a roar. Buried at the bottom of the box, hidden beneath worn clothes and forgotten trinkets, was something their aunt had overlooked, something she never expected them to find. A clue, a secret, a set of papers that would unravel her lies and expose the truth about who the mansion really belonged to. The children stared at the papers with wide eyes, their hearts pounding. In that instant, the cold streets and empty stomachs didn't matter as much, because now they had something stronger than despair. They had proof. They had a weapon. They had hope. The box had always been more than a container of things. To anyone else, it was just a battered cardboard square, taped along the edges, sagging under the weight of years. But to them, it was sacred. It was the last thread connecting them to the world before their aunt's betrayal, the world where family meant safety, where love wrapped itself around them like a warm blanket, and where the mansion wasn't just a building but the heartbeat of their lives. They had carried that box through everything, From the marble steps where their aunt sneered down at them, to the cold benches of the bus stop, to motels where the walls smelled of mildew and smoke. It was heavy, inconvenient even, but they never once considered leaving it behind. Inside were fragments of their parents, laughter caught in photographs, the smell of perfume clinging faintly to an old scarf, the steady scrawl of their father's handwriting in a notebook. Whenever the world became too unbearable, they opened the box not because it had answers, but because it reminded them that they had once belonged somewhere. On that gray afternoon, the rain had left everything slick and reflective. Puddles caught the shape of the mansion in their memories, like ghosts staring back at them. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, and exhaustion pulled at their bones. They sat on the edge of a cracked sidewalk, pulling the box close once again, not expecting salvation, only comfort. But this time, something felt different. Desperation has a way of sharpening the eyes, of making you notice things you've overlooked 100 times before. As they sifted through the usual photographs and trinkets, their fingers pressed against something stiff, something that didn't belong among the soft fabric of old clothes. It was an envelope, yellowed, worn, but intact. The wax seal had cracked, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Their breath caught in their throats, because there was no mistaking the bold, deliberate strokes of their father's pen. It wasn't addressed to their aunt. It wasn't to some lawyer or banker. It was to them. Their hands shook as they tore it open, the paper fragile yet strong enough to hold the weight of his words. And as they read, it was as if his voice returned, steady and full of quiet power. "If you are reading this," it began, "then fate has taken me from you sooner than I wished. But you must remember this: what I leave behind is yours, not to be questioned, not to be stolen, and never to be doubted. The home you grew up in, the land it sits upon, the legacy I built, it belongs to you, my children, and no one else." Tears blurred the ink, but they couldn't stop reading. The letter spoke of foresight. Their father had known the dangers of greed. He had seen how envy could eat at family bonds, and he had taken steps to protect them. The mansion wasn't just a house. It was secured within a trust, its ownership written in black and white, locked behind legal chains that could not be broken by lies or manipulation. Their father had even left instructions: look deeper in the box. He had hidden the legal documents there himself, in case something ever went wrong. Their hands fumbled, hearts pounding as they dug beneath the last layers of clothing, and then they saw it a thick folder bound with string. Their fingers trembled as they pulled it free, untied the knot, and spread the papers out across their laps. There it was, the deed to the mansion, the trust agreement, pages of financial statements, each stamped with seals and signatures that spoke louder than any story their aunt could spin. And at the bottom of it all, in bold ink, their names clear, undeniable, unshakable. They weren't just children cast aside. They were heirs. They were the rightful owners. For a long moment, the world seemed to tilt. The traffic on the street blurred into silence. The drizzle faded, and the cold in their bones lifted. All they could see were those papers shining like armor. Their aunt's smug words, "This house is mine now," not yours, echoed in their minds, only now they felt different, hollow, weak, a lie that was about to collapse under the weight of truth. Hope surged through them, stronger than it had been in months. It wasn't the fragile, flickering flame they'd carried in secret. It was fire now, burning through despair, consuming every shadow their aunt had cast over their lives. And yet, the fire carried fear with it too. Because what if no one believed them? What if the courts were swayed by money or influence? What if the papers that seemed like salvation turned out to be nothing more than relics of a plan their father hadn't fully secured? But even with fear clawing at their throats, determination rose higher. Their father had not been careless. He had been deliberate. He had prepared for this moment. And now, armed with the truth, they weren't powerless anymore. That night, they spread the documents out on the motel bed, reading them line by line, memorizing every phrase and every signature. Their father's wisdom was there in every clause, every safeguard. It was as though he had anticipated the betrayal that would come and had carved a path for them to follow when the darkness fell. By dawn, exhaustion weighed heavy on their eyes, but their spirits were sharper than ever. The time for waiting, for hiding, for merely surviving was over. They had been cast out like beggars, but they would return as rightful heirs. Their aunt thought she had destroyed them, but the truth was about to surface. And when it did, it wouldn't just take the mansion from her hands, it would strip away every ounce of false power she thought she had. When dawn broke the next morning, it was not like the mornings before. For weeks, sunlight had felt cruel, almost mocking, as if the world outside was moving on while they remained trapped in misery. But on this day, light slipped through the thin motel curtains and landed directly on the papers spread across the bed, and suddenly it didn't feel indifferent anymore. It felt purposeful, almost as though the world itself was acknowledging their discovery. For a long time, the siblings just sat there, staring at the documents, their hearts thudding. These weren't scraps of memory or trinkets of the past, they were proof. They were power. For so long they had been forced to live as though they were invisible, worthless, without claim to even the roof over their heads. But now, the truth lay in front of them, written in signatures and stamped in seals. They were the heirs, and no one, not even their aunt, could erase that. Yet with hope came a chilling reminder: paper, no matter how powerful, could not defend itself. Their aunt had already proven how manipulative, how venomous, how relentless she could be. She had convinced neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives that casting her nieces and nephews out onto the street was for their own good. She had wrapped her cruelty in ribbons of false justification and made people believe her. If they thought she would crumble simply because they walked to the gates of the mansion holding a folder of documents, they were mistaken. She would fight back with every ounce of her venom, and so the siblings realized something vital. They would need more than evidence. They would need allies. At the small wooden table in their motel room, they huddled together. Their voices were low, heavy with tension, but sparking with determination. "She won't give up easily," one of them whispered, tracing a finger over their father's signature. "She'll call us liars. She'll twist this. She'll say we forged it. She'll say we don't deserve it." Another sibling clenched their fists and shook their head. "Then we fight. We don't stop. We've come too far to let her win again." That was the turning point, the moment survival shifted into defiance. But they couldn't do it alone. The law was a maze, and though their father had left them the key, they needed someone who could guide them through the labyrinth. They needed a lawyer. Finding one, however, was not easy. They had no money, no resources, no safety net. Most doors slammed shut as soon as they explained their situation. Some lawyers laughed in their faces, dismissing them as desperate children clinging to fantasies. Others shook their heads sympathetically but turned them away, citing fees that were far beyond their reach. Each rejection was another knife twist, another attempt to strip away the fragile hope they carried. But then finally, they found him. His office wasn't grand. The furniture was worn, the walls crowded with books stacked in uneven towers, and the faint smell of coffee and paper lingered in the air. He looked at them with eyes that didn't skim over their ragged clothes or their tired faces. Instead, he looked at the documents. He read carefully, his brow furrowing, his lips pressing into a line, and then, slowly, he leaned forward and said the words that made their hearts ignite. You might just have a case that could shake her to the core. It was the first time an adult had looked at them not with pity, not with doubt, but with belief. The lawyer explained what lay ahead. The process would not be simple. There would be filings, motions, hearings. Their aunt would use every trick she could, stalling, intimidating, twisting the narrative. But the lawyer's voice carried a steady certainty. If they stood firm, if they didn't allow her lies to break them, they could win. The siblings left his office with a new kind of fire inside them. But they knew this wasn't only a legal battle. It was also a battle of endurance, of resilience, of spirit. Their aunt hadn't just taken their home, she had tried to take their confidence, their worth, their belief in themselves. To fight her, they would have to rebuild what she had tried to destroy. So they began to prepare in every way they could. They studied the documents until they could recite key phrases word for word. They practiced how they would answer questions, rehearsing late into the night until their voices didn't tremble anymore. They wrote down memories of their father, details of his words, stories that anchored the truth. They grew stronger together, each sibling becoming the other's shield. And in their darkest moments, when fear whispered that their aunt was too powerful, that they were still just children thrown away, they would open their father's letter and read it again. Every word was like armor. Every sentence reminded them that they weren't weak, that their father had seen this coming and had armed them long before they realized it. By the time the week of the hearing arrived, they were different. They weren't the broken children who had once stood shivering at the gates of their own home, begging to be let inside. They weren't the silent shadows who slept on benches and wondered if life had already passed them by. They were heirs, they were fighters, and they were ready. The mansion no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt like destiny, and destiny was waiting in the courtroom. The morning sun was merciless, flooding the courthouse steps with light as if the heavens themselves wanted every secret exposed. The siblings stood frozen at the base of the steps, staring at the doors that seemed to loom like a gateway to fate itself. Their lawyer urged them forward, reminding them in a steady voice, "Today is not about her words. Today is about the truth." But their hearts still raced with the weight of years of humiliation, fear, and loss. Inside, the air was cool and heavy, the faint scent of polished wood and old paper filling their lungs. Every footstep echoed, and with each echo came the reminder that this was no dream. This was real. The benches creaked as people shuffled, eager to witness the clash of family against family, greed against justice. Then she entered. Their aunt, draped in an expensive coat, diamonds catching the light like shards of ice. She walked slowly, deliberately, her heels clacking against the marble floor in a rhythm of arrogance. She didn't look at the judge or the clerk or even the lawyer beside her. No, her eyes locked on them. A smirk curled across her face, the kind that said she had already won, the kind that used to terrify them when they were powerless children under her roof. She leaned in as she passed their table, her perfume suffocating, her whisper venomous. "This little act will crumble. The house is mine. It's always been mine. And when the judge laughs you out of here, you'll have nowhere left to crawl." But this time, her words didn't crush them. This time, they sat straighter, their hands interlocked beneath the table. They weren't the children she had tossed out into the streets. They were heirs armed with truth. The gavel struck sharp as thunder, and the courtroom settled into silence. Her lawyer rose first. Slick, confident, every syllable coated with false charm. He painted her as a saint, a woman who had sacrificed years of her life to care for children who gave nothing in return. He twisted stories, turning neglect into discipline, cruelty into sacrifice. He wagged his finger toward the siblings, calling them ungrateful, entitled liars, grasping at straws. His voice carried, smooth and persuasive, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room was swaying toward him, like the truth was slipping through their fingers. The siblings' hearts pounded in unison. The old fear clawed at their throats. She had fooled people before. What if she fooled the judge too? But then their lawyer stood. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He let the silence breathe, the tension coil, until every ear strained for his words. When he spoke, it was steady, grounded, like the voice of reason cutting through the fog. "Your Honor," he said, his hand resting on the folder that contained everything, "we are not here to hear performances. We are here for the truth, and the truth in black and white leaves no room for her lies." He pulled out the deed. The crisp paper seemed to echo as he placed it on the stand. "This is the legal deed to the mansion in question. It does not, nor has it ever bear her name." The judge leaned forward, scanning it, his eyes narrowing. Next came the trust documents, thick, undeniable. This trust, established by their late father, places the estate and all its assets solely in the hands of his children. The lawyer's voice grew firmer with each word. "Not her, never her." A murmur rippled through the benches. Heads turned, whispers hissed. The aunt's face tightened, the color draining from her cheeks. And then the letter, their father's final words. The lawyer unfolded it carefully, as though handling something sacred. His voice softened, resonant, as he read aloud. To my children, this home is yours. It will always be yours. Do not let anyone take it from you. Stand firm. Stand together. The room froze. The words carried not just authority, but love, echoing across the wooden walls, sinking into every heart present. Some spectators even wiped at their eyes. The siblings sat motionless, tears streaming, their hands gripping each other tighter. They had waited so long to hear those words spoken aloud, not just in the quiet of their own hearts, but in a place where the world had to listen. Their aunt shot up, her composure shattering. Her voice cracked, shrill and frantic. Forgery, lies, they forced him. He never meant this. They're thieves, all of them. She slammed her hand on the table, her jewelry clattering. The judge's gavel banged, sharp and commanding. Sit down, or you will be held in contempt. Her lawyer scrambled, tugging at her sleeve, trying to calm her, but the mask was gone. The calm, collected woman who strutted in moments ago was replaced by someone unraveling before their eyes. The siblings' lawyer didn't need theatrics. He simply stepped closer to the bench, his voice calm, controlled, deadly in its precision. Your Honor, these documents are notarized, sealed, and filed with the court. There is no forgery, no deception. The law is clear. The estate never belonged to her. Every action she has taken against these children was not just cruel, it was baseless. She has lived in a mansion that was never hers, and today, the truth strips away her claim. The aunt collapsed into her chair, her face pale, her lips trembling. The smug smile was gone. In its place was panic. The room buzzed with whispers, shock spreading like wildfire. The siblings could barely breathe. Every nerve in their bodies felt electrified. For so long, they had lived under the shadow of her lies, crushed by her power. But now, in front of everyone, the truth stood taller than her arrogance ever could. And yet, one thing still remained. The judge's final ruling. The gavel tapped once, twice, and all fell silent. The siblings held their breath as the judge leaned forward, his words about to decide everything. The air in the courtroom hung thick, like the moment before a storm breaks. Every eye was fixed on the judge, his stern face illuminated under the soft glow of the high lights. He sat in silence for a long moment, flipping through the stack of documents once more, his fingers deliberate, his gaze unhurried. Each rustle of paper sounded like thunder in the stillness, each pause stretching into eternity. The siblings barely breathed, their hearts drummed in their ears, their palms damp as they clutched each other's hands like lifelines. Across the room, their aunt shifted in her seat. Her jaw was tight, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. She tried to maintain her composure, to keep the haughty mask she always wore, but cracks had already formed. Her painted smile trembled. Her fingers tapped against the table, sharp and nervous. She glanced at her lawyer, but even he avoided her eyes now, sensing the ground slipping out from beneath them both. Finally, the judge cleared his throat, his voice low but commanding. I have reviewed the evidence presented, the deed to the mansion, the trust documents, the letter written in the deceased's own hand. All are verified, authenticated, and binding. He looked up, his gaze landing directly on her. This estate never belonged to you. It was never yours to claim. It belongs to the rightful heirship's children. The words dropped like a hammer. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Neighbors whispered. Distant relatives widened their eyes. Some even gasped out loud, the sound carrying in waves across the benches. The siblings froze, their eyes burning with tears they struggled to hold back. For so long they had been silenced, dismissed, made to feel invisible, and now, finally, the truth stood tall, undeniable. Their aunt's face twisted, a storm of fury and disbelief. She shot up from her chair, her voice shrill and breaking. No, that's a lie. It's a trick. I've lived in that house. I've run it. I've kept it alive. They don't deserve it. They've done nothing. Nothing. Her words cracked like glass. Desperate. Frantic. The judge's gavel slammed once, its echo rattling the wood panels. Enough. His voice rose with finality. Your occupation of the property was unauthorized. Your attempts to control and exploit it were unlawful. And your treatment of these children under the guise of guardianship is reprehensible. His eyes narrowed, hard as steel. You manipulated, you lied, you took advantage. This court will not reward cruelty. She faltered, her chest heaving, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for someone, anyone to take her side. But no one moved. The onlookers stared back at her not with sympathy, but with judgment. The mask of control she had worn for years shattered before them all. Then came the strike that would finish it. The judge leaned forward, his tone calm but devastating. You are hereby stripped of all claims to the estate. Effective immediately, you will vacate the premises. The mansion and its holdings belong exclusively to the children, by blood, by law, and by the expressed will of their late father. He paused, letting the words sink deep into the silence. This matter is closed. The gavel fell, boom, sharp, final, echoing through the chamber like the crack of destiny. The aunt's scream split the silence. High, ragged, furious, she stumbled forward, her diamond bracelet sliding down her wrist as her hand shook violently. You can't do this to me. You can't take it away. It's mine, she cried, pointing at the siblings with a trembling finger, her voice breaking into sobs of rage. You'll regret this. All of you will regret this. The bailiff stepped closer, firm, his hand ready to restrain her if she lunged forward. She sank back into her chair, shaking, her hair disheveled, her face wet with angry tears. The empire she thought she commanded crumbled in an instant, reduced to ashes in front of everyone she had once fooled. The siblings sat motionless, tears streaming silently down their cheeks. For years, their aunt's voice had drowned out theirs. For years, her lies had carried more weight than their truth. And now the tables had turned. The truth stood taller than her deception, brighter than her greed, stronger than her cruelty. They were not broken children anymore. They were heirs, they were survivors, and they had won. The aunt slumped in her seat, a hollow shell of the tyrant she once appeared to be. Her jewels glittered under the courtroom light, but they looked gaudy now, meaningless, like broken armor that couldn't protect her anymore. The siblings exchanged a glance, and though neither spoke, their father's words seemed to whisper between them, "Stand firm, stand together." They had done just that. As they rose from their seats, the room seemed different. The walls that once felt like prison bars now felt like pillars of victory. They walked past their aunt without a word, their silence more cutting than any insult could ever be. She turned her face away, unable to meet their eyes, but as they stepped out of the courtroom, the echo of her bitter scream still clung to the air. The battle for the truth was over, but the journey to reclaim their lives, their home, their peace, their future was only just beginning. The siblings had dreamed of this moment for years, but when it finally arrived, it didn't feel real at first. Walking out of the courthouse, their steps felt almost weightless, as if they were no longer tied to the earth by the burden of injustice. Yet the thought kept pulsing in their minds. Their mansion was waiting. The ride back felt endless. Neither of them spoke for the longest time, their thoughts tangled in a storm of memory. Every mile of road leading them closer to the house carried fragments of the past, childhood laughter echoing down the hallways, their father's voice filling the rooms with warmth, the sound of their aunt's heels striking the marble floors like hammers of authority. The mansion was not just a house, it was every emotion they had ever known, carved into stone, woven into wood, soaked into the very air. When the mansion finally came into view, it seemed to rise out of the earth like a monument, proud and timeless. The setting sun splashed its tall windows in a golden glow, almost as if the house itself was shining in celebration of their return. The ivy clung to the stone like veins of memory, alive and restless. For years, they had been forced to see this place as a cage. Tonight, it looked like destiny. The iron gates groaned open slowly, almost hesitantly, as though the mansion itself was testing whether the rightful heirs had truly come home. The siblings stepped through, their shoes crunching against the gravel, the sound ringing in their ears like a drumbeat of triumph. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, not with dread, but with the sheer gravity of the moment. This wasn't just walking toward a house. This was walking back into everything that had been stolen from them. They stopped at the base of the stairs, staring up at the grand double doors. How many times had they stood here, barred from entry, forced to beg for scraps of kindness that never came? How many nights had they sat just outside those very doors, cast into the cold while their aunt enjoyed the warmth of the hearth inside? Those memories pressed against them like ghosts, but they did not turn away. The key trembled in the older sibling's hand. It was their father's key, the very one the aunt had tried to bury in paperwork and deceit. Sliding it into the lock, they held their breath. For a second, the door resisted, frozen with years of misuse, but then, with a solid click, it turned. The doors swung open, releasing a breath of air that smelled of oak, dust, and something achingly familiar, their father's cologne, faint but alive, like a spirit waiting for them. They stepped inside. The mansion greeted them with silence, yet it was not the silence of oppression they once knew. This silence was full of possibility, heavy with the weight of history. The marble floor stretched before them, gleaming faintly in the soft light. The grand chandelier above still sparkled, 1,000 crystals catching fragments of sunlight that spilled through the tall windows. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its banisters smooth and polished, like a spine holding the entire house upright. They wandered slowly, their footsteps echoing across the halls like a song of return. In the library, thick layers of dust clung to the books, but the air felt alive with knowledge. Their father's chair still sat by the window, facing the garden, his favorite spot. It looked as though he might walk back in at any moment and sink into it, pipe in hand, ready to share a story. In the dining hall, the long table stood empty. How many times had their aunt presided over this room, her sharp words slicing deeper than any knife? Now it was silent, but not empty. It was waiting. Waiting for laughter, waiting for love, waiting for a family to gather again without cruelty poisoning the air. The siblings reached the parlor, where portraits stretched across the walls. Generations of ancestors stared down at them, painted eyes heavy with history and judgment. And there, in the center, was their father. His portrait seemed alive, his eyes filled with quiet strength, his lips curved into a faint smile. It was as if he had been waiting too, watching from his place on the wall for the moment his children would return and claim what was rightfully theirs. Tears welled in their eyes. The younger sibling reached out, fingertips brushing the frame. "We made it back," they whispered, their voice breaking. "We're home." For a moment the mansion seemed to breathe with them. The walls hummed with memory. The beams seemed to stand taller, and the air seemed warmer. It was no longer a place of torment. It was a sanctuary, a fortress of their bloodline, a promise fulfilled. But standing there, they also felt the weight of responsibility. This was not just a victory, it was a beginning. The mansion was theirs, yes, but so was the duty to honor it, to protect it, to fill it with the love and life their father had intended. The siblings stood in the center of the grand hall, their hands clasped, their eyes lifted to the glittering chandelier above. And for the first time in years, they didn't feel like intruders. They felt like what they truly were: heirs, survivors, owners of their destiny. The mansion had been taken from them, twisted into a weapon of cruelty, but they had reclaimed it. And in reclaiming it, they reclaimed themselves. When the gavel fell, the aunt lost more than a case. She lost the illusion she had built her entire life upon. For years, she had paraded herself as the rightful owner of the mansion, basking in its wealth as though it were her crown. She stood tall in the windows, looking down at the very children she had thrown into the streets, treating them like weeds she had cut from her perfect garden. But now, stripped of her claim, she was exposed no longer a queen in her palace, but a thief in borrowed clothes, a squatter in a house that was never hers to begin with. Her fall was swift and merciless. She retreated to a small rental house on the outskirts of town, far from the marble pillars and crystal chandeliers she once flaunted. Gone were the glittering lights, the velvet drapes, the echo of her heels across polished stone floors. In their place stood peeling wallpaper, sagging ceilings, and silence so thick it gnawed at her bones. The jewels she once wore to flaunt her power now lay forgotten in drawers she could barely afford to keep locked. She had once walked across marble in jeweled heels. Now she shuffled barefoot across linoleum, each creak of the floorboards a cruel reminder of how far she had fallen. And the townspeople noticed. Where once they smiled politely, half believing her stories of inheritance and power, now they whispered with venom. At the market, voices followed her down every aisle. That's the one who stole from her own blood. Can you imagine tossing children into the streets? Her name, once spoken with respect, was now spit out with disgust. She carried her groceries in silence, her eyes lowered, her shoulders hunched. The gossip was unrelenting, a punishment no gavel could deliver, a sentence she could never appeal. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, life was blooming again. The siblings walked through its halls cautiously at first, almost afraid to touch the walls, as though the house itself might disappear if they believed in it too much. But as days passed, they breathed easier, their laughter returning like music long silenced. They polished the wood until it shone, washed the windows until sunlight poured in without restraint, and opened the curtains that had been shut tight for so long. Warmth filled the house again, as if it had been waiting all along for its true heirs to return. The grand dining hall, once a stage for cruelty, was reborn as a place of belonging. They set the long table with their father's china, the plates gleaming under the chandelier's glow. Each meal was more than food, it was a ceremony, a reminder of survival, of victory, of family. Where once silence had smothered the room, laughter now rang freely, bouncing off the walls until the whole house seemed to hum with joy. The library became their sanctuary. Dusty tomes abandoned by the ant were lifted from shelves, their spines cracked open, their wisdom absorbed under the soft flicker of lamps. Sometimes they read together, sharing passages that made them laugh or cry. Other times they sat alone, each lost in words, but bound together by the quiet presence of their father's spirit. Every book felt like a thread tying them back to him, to the lessons he had left behind. Even the garden returned to life. They tore out the weeds, cut away the thorns, and nursed the roses that had struggled in the shadows. Within weeks, blooms erupted in a riot of colored roses of defiance, white blossoms of peace, petals trembling in the wind like whispers of resilience. It was as though the earth itself had sighed in relief, freed from the suffocation of greed, finally thriving under hands that nurtured instead of hoarded. But the sweetest moment came one afternoon when the aunt returned. She stood at the mansion's gates, her once perfect hair tangled, her makeup smeared, her voice raw with desperation. "This is still my house!" she screamed, her hands rattling the iron bars, her face contorted with rage and panic. She cried out their names, begged, cursed, demanded, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to claw back what had slipped through her fingers. The siblings stood on the balcony above, watching her from their rightful place. They did not yell back. They did not curse her. They did not descend into the mud of her desperation. They simply stood silent, steady, united. Their very presence spoke louder than words, declaring what no court ruling or paper could truly capture: the mansion was theirs. Her screams echoed against the gates, hollow, powerless, until her voice broke into nothing but croaks. Finally, with her shoulders trembling and her pride in ruins, she turned and stormed down the long road, her figure shrinking into the distance. And just like that, the roles were reversed. Once she had stood behind those gates, casting them out into the streets with arrogance and cruelty. Now it was she who walked away, shut out forever. Inside, the siblings closed the balcony doors behind them, shutting out her shadow once and for all. The silence that followed was not heavy, it was peaceful, triumphant even. The mansion no longer carried the weight of her greed. It was theirs, fully, truly, and forever. That night they gathered in the grand hall beneath the chandelier. The light danced across the crystal, scattering fragments of brilliance onto the walls. They sat together, remembering the cold nights when benches were their beds, the hunger that clawed at their stomachs, the humiliation of being branded unworthy. They remembered the sting of betrayal by someone who should have protected them. And then they looked around, the laughter, the warmth, the home that was theirs once again, and realized something extraordinary. They were not broken. They were not defeated. They were stronger. The mansion was no longer a prison of pain. It was a symbol of justice, of resilience, of love that had endured even beyond death. Their father's wisdom had outlived the aunt's cruelty, his promises carried out in full. The children had not just survived, they had risen, and somewhere, in the quiet hum of the house, in the glow of the lights that warmed its walls, it almost felt as though their father was there too, watching, smiling, proud. In the end, the aunt tossed them into the streets, believing she had destroyed them, but what she never understood was this: the mansion had never been hers, it had always been theirs, and now the world knew it too. Years passed, but the memory of that night when the gavel fell never faded. The mansion, once a battlefield of betrayal, transformed into a beacon of legacy and hope. Its marble floors no longer echoed with loneliness, but with footsteps of friends, family, and future generations who came through its doors. Where there had once been silence and fear, now there was music, laughter, and life. The siblings grew into their roles not as heirs flaunting wealth, but as guardians of what had been entrusted to them. They opened the mansion's doors to those in need, offering shelter where once they themselves had been denied. The dining hall became more than a place for family meals. It became a gathering space where neighbors were welcomed, where the lonely found company, and where no one left hungry. The garden flourished as never before. Roses climbed high along the stone walls, their blooms spilling like waterfalls of color. Children from the town played under the shade of the trees, their laughter carried on the wind. The mansion was no longer just a house. It was alive, breathing with the spirit of community and love, exactly as their father had wanted. As for the aunt, she became a ghost in the town's memory. She lived out her days in obscurity, a figure shrunken by her own greed. People no longer whispered her name in fear or respect. They hardly spoke of her at all. Time stripped her of the power she once clung to, leaving her nothing but a cautionary tale told quietly. The story of a woman who lost everything because she thought only of herself. The siblings, however, carried their scars with pride. They remembered the benches that bruised their backs, the hunger that sharpened their resolve, the doors that closed in their faces. Those memories became their armor, shaping them into leaders who understood suffering and valued kindness. They had been broken down to nothing, yet had risen stronger than anyone imagined. On quiet evenings, they often sat together on the balcony overlooking the gates, where their aunt had once screamed her last desperate claims. The iron bars no longer seemed like barriers, but like guardians, keeping the peace within their walls. And in the stillness, they sometimes felt their father's presence soft, steady, proud. His voice seemed to whisper through the leaves, reminding them that promises made in love never die. The mansion stood tall, no longer a symbol of greed, but of endurance. Its legacy was restored not through wealth or power, but through the resilience of those who refused to give up. And so, the children who were once cast into the streets became the heirs who rose above betrayal. Their story was etched into the very walls of the home that had nearly been stolen, a story of survival, justice, and unbreakable family bonds. In the end, the mansion belonged not just to them, but to every life they touched with the strength they had earned. It was their victory, their inheritance, their legacy, and it would stand long after whispers of the aunt had faded into dust.